Anyway, so tonight Ian is, if you all remember Ian Sachs, he comes to us as a volunteer, and he's doing this out of the goodness of his heart, helping us. So first, before we get started, I really want to thank him. He's going to walk us through everything that came out of the workshop that we did about 6 weeks ago. So he's put together for us a report on short-term action items and long-term action items. But just in general, I really want to thank Ian, first obviously for walking us through this workshop, putting together the report. He also has taken time off from work and gone with me to meetings with Jersey City and with the county to figure out how long-term we can create an alternate route for Patterson Plank. And as many of you may know, he's also helping with a proposal for bike lanes in Hoboken. So he's a real asset to our community. And in his professional experience, he is working with New Jersey Transit on some of these other issues. So really want to thank him. So he's going to introduce, basically short-term, long-term action items for us. This is going to be a living, breathing document that we're already working on doing a lot of these things, and look forward to your input. Thank you. Okay. Turn over to you.
All right, so it's pretty, most of you were, I think almost everybody, it looks really weird.
That's right. Okay.
I have to, actually, you know what? I'm limited by no extension cord, and so sorry. I think almost everyone here was at the first workshop, which was in April, and the purpose here is, there's this development, and this existing development already happening in Southwest Hoboken, and there's going to be more development in the future. The existing industrial and commercial uses don't really represent what the future type of development is going to be, so there's a switch in the way that the public space, the road space, and other public space is going to be used in the future. Right now, the roadways currently just move traffic in and out of Hoboken in that southwest area. It's starting to change a little bit. More people are getting out on the streets, but that's how a lot of people perceive that, especially people who've been living here for a long time. In the future, there'll be a residential and mixed-use developments, and that's expected to increase more, kind of pushing out the industrial and commercial uses to some extent. And there needs to be this balance of traffic operations in the future, that better balance between that existing use of getting traffic in and out of Hoboken, but at the same time accommodating the future residential mixed use to feel the area more in line with what the rest of Hoboken is. So with those kind of concerns for Southwest Hoboken, Dawn had asked me to assist in this process of getting the community's input, all of your input in the ideas on how to make that area better and how to kind of fold it into the walkable feel that most of the rest of Hoboken has. So in April, we had our community workshop. It was on a Tuesday evening where we sat in different groups, addressed specific issues like park space and traffic and pedestrian bicycle needs. Those different groups came up with a long list of ideas. All those ideas were recorded. I took all those ideas and compiled them into sets of concepts that were, in general, short and long-term action items. But then you could also classify them in terms of traffic, parking, public space, and so forth. Some of the same ideas came up in different groups. Some groups had original ideas that weren't discussed in other groups, so I tried to compile all those. And this is a really great document, not just because I wrote it, but because it's a compilation of all these different ideas coming straight from the community that the city can now use and move ahead on, and it's a very valuable group of information. So those ideas are compiled. We're here now. I'm presenting a summary of those ideas. They're compiled in a memorandum. It's about 5 pages. It's brief. It just gets to the point, which is the short and long-term action items that were found. What we're hoping is that if whoever's interested will take a copy of this memorandum, look at it in more detail, because this presentation just briefly summarizes those ideas. And make sure that we didn't miss anything, that things that are priority are highlighted in here, and that all of your ideas and concerns were taken into consideration. And then The next steps are to see how the Transportation and Parking Subcommittee and the city itself wants to take these ideas and move forward in incorporating the recommendations from the community, your recommendations, into the future steps that the city will take towards dealing with the traffic and open space concerns. So, a summary or a rundown of the short-term action items. These are things that take little or no planning or effort to start implementing right away. Starting out with, we heard a lot of discussion about the enforcement of illegal parking, people who aren't stopping properly at stop signs or rolling into crosswalks, or parking in crosswalks, unnecessary honking of horns at certain locations, talking on the cell phones. There's a lot of enforcement concerns that probably because of the industrial nature of that part of the city have been overlooked for a long time, and that now as that becomes more of a lived-in area of the city, enforcement is more of a necessity in that area, just as it is in other parts of the city. An effort to improve the pedestrian visibility in crosswalks. Just back up to the first point, the parking is not just illegal parking on the street, but also parking on the sidewalk. So there's this clearing of the sidewalks and returning it back to the pedestrian use, which is what it's intended for. There was this need to communicate to drivers that this is a pedestrian area. So one of the comments that I heard in my group was that as people drive into the city, they don't necessarily register that this is a walkable pedestrian area until they get past the first few streets. And so there needs to be ways to communicate this, and that can be done via signage, via the way that the streetscape is designed, and those things can be considered as the development moves forward. Reviewing of parking policies, pricing of permits, and promoting car sharing. We heard all of these ideas as ways to reduce congestion, reduce traffic, and either free up or ensure that there's future availability of parking spaces in the area. Collaborating with private landowners to share space. There was an interesting complementary set of ideas from different groups where everybody was looking for ways to make certain spaces available to everyone, even though they're private. Some of those places were, for example, Connor's parking lot. That could perhaps be used as something else, such as a playground. 401st Street, it's a senior garden, but it's not publicly accessible, and there was an idea why couldn't that space be made more publicly accessible so there'd be more interaction with seniors, as well as the benches in front of 200 Adams Street. And so there are other private lots, for example, those that are adjacent to some churches that perhaps could be used more regularly, more in complementary uses. Identifying areas to expand public space, include public space in all Southwest plans. There's been some great progress on that over the past couple of weeks. Most of us are aware of the progress that the city's been making in ensuring that there's public space included in the plans for Southwest. And this is echoed in the comments that we heard in April. Including Southwest Hoboken in the ongoing bicycle master plan effort. This is a bit of a twist of what was actually said. There were comments that said that Southwest Hoboken should be included in bicycle and pedestrian-friendly efforts. But as most of you know, there's a strong effort going on right now to push for a bicycle plan and bicycle routes and lanes in the city of Hoboken. And so I'm just kind of rephrasing this slightly to say that this should be included, this idea should be, this area, Southwest Hoboken, should be included in this ongoing plan effort. Collaborating with the Hoboken Fire Department to open Madison Street from Newark Street. In my group, I was fortunate enough to have is he the existing commissioner, or is he the
Fire chief,
the current fire chief, who said that with a few small concerns that from what I understood could be easily addressed, the fire department would be willing to listen to the idea of opening up that section of Madison Street. And that's really critical because that's another way to get into Hoboken. If you've heard me talk at all about access in and out of the city, whatever forum that may be, one of the big challenges in South Hoboken is that there's really you're trying to get into the city, you've got Jackson Street or Park. So there's really only those two options to get into the city grid. And opening up Madison would create one more access point, and that would alleviate some of the pressure at those other two locations. And considering more on-street parking along Observer Highway to calm traffic. As this area of the city becomes more pedestrian friendly, becomes more lived in, becomes more walkable, one way to change the perspective of drivers of this area is to change certain streets back to more of a community feel that's consistent with the rest of Hoboken. And in places along Observer Highway that currently operate as a highway or just as this conduit to get vehicles from one place to another, there are opportunities to put in on-street parking. Yes, that will slow down traffic. Yes, that will add to a little bit of the impedance of traffic in and out of the city. But that's part of the balance between the public space and the conversion of this area of Hoboken into a more livable area, and also balancing the conduit of traffic in and out of the city. So these are all short-term action items that require very little effort to be implemented and can be done in a short amount of time. As far as some of the longer-term action items that were heard and reported in those in the different groups, first on the list is to identify and study the possibility of new traffic signals. As far as pedestrian safety goes, the crossing of certain streets can be significantly enhanced if pedestrians have their own crossing signal. And there are certain places where the traffic volumes are high enough that those signals could be warranted. It's just a matter of collecting traffic volumes, running through a simple process of determining what combination of volumes result in a signal being warranted. That's the technical term for being allowed to be installed based on national standards, and then designing the installation of that signal. There's a cost associated with that. The design process takes a little bit of time, but a lot of those locations could be done in collaboration with the county. So there's an opportunity to do that, and it doesn't take a huge amount of effort to do. Traffic-specific guidelines for the impact of new projects in Southwest Hoboken. As development occurs, there's an opportunity to be a little bit stronger in terms of asking those developers to identify what the effects of their development will have on the traffic and what they will do to try to ameliorate those traffic, any type of impacts that they have. It's a fairly simple process that can be done. It's not an expensive process for the developer, and for the city. It's just a matter of saying we want more. We want some sort of documentation to demonstrate what the effects of your development will have in this area. Study ingress, egress options and solutions for major bottlenecks. Probably the topic that sparked the whole intent of this workshop and the discussion is the fact that there are bottlenecks in South Hoboken, and the majority of them come from vehicles entering and exiting through that one section of the city. When we talked about ingress and egress options to begin with, I was just talking about them earlier, the fact that there are very little ways to get in and out of the urban grid. And I started out by these small sketches, and I can pass these out to anybody who wants to see them, but we're basically identifying the fact that there are very few places to get in and out of the city, and if it were possible to open up more access to the city, you would really distribute the concentration of traffic that happens at
this one that I'm handing out shows all 6, so if you want.
Okay. Is this the one that says exit options?
This one has the entering options.
Okay.
From Henderson Street, which is really Marin Boulevard.
Right. If there were a way to open up Marin Boulevard, then there would be a lot more ways to get into the city. And the reality is that people who live in the city don't all live on the western side of the city or on the eastern side of the city, but those are really the only 2 places that you can get to. So you either have to come in on the western side of the city and then filter through the streets, or you have to come in the eastern side of the city and then double back. It's your choice, whichever one you think is quicker. But opening up access into the city, Jackson, you have Jackson Street already. If Madison were made available, And then if Marin were made available, then you could get to Adams and to Clinton streets. That would really reduce the amount of congestion at any one particular location. And I've said this in other forums, and I'll just repeat it again here, that the volume of traffic of vehicles, the number of vehicles entering the city, trying to get in, for example, at Jackson Street, is not really high. It looks really high when you're sitting in that queue or you're trying to get around them or you're trying to make that turn. It's not really high. It's like, at the peak I've seen it, the worst times, 40 or 50 cars. That sounds like a lot of cars, but from a traffic engineer's perspective, it's not a lot of cars. The real challenge is the fact that there's opposing traffic and those cars can't make the turn, so you're waiting a long time. If you distribute those 40 or 50 cars to 4 or 5 different locations to make those turns, 10 cars in an hour's time is not a lot of traffic at all, and it would almost vanish. So opening up access to the south to the urban grid of Hoboken somehow, some way, would dramatically improve the existing congestion that we all experience in this part of the city. Considering closure of unnecessary roadway segments, there was some talk, particularly with respect to the development plans for the open space of the park in Southwest Hoboken, that there are some segments of streets that may or may not be as useful as they are now. It's very much worthwhile to look into whether or not certain segments of streets should continue to remain open. Are they more of a cost or a detriment to traffic operations than they are a benefit? Particularly those intersections that create a five-legged, street segments that create a five-legged intersection. Those are the ones that you really want to target to see if they are really necessary anymore. Because if you get rid of that one leg and you normalize that intersection to 4 legs, the operation of the signal improve dramatically, and you also gain back a lot of space for sidewalks or for public space.
What specifically roads are you talking about, unnecessary roads, anything specifically?
Well, it's not my place to say whether our street should or shouldn't go, so it needs to be studied, but what was discussed at the workshop was the segment of Patterson Plank Road between Jackson and Monroe. So as it intersects with Observer Highway, that small segment, it's kind of hard to envision, and I don't think we're going to, but everyone has a map, so it's fine. So you can see it.
It's actually Jackson Henderson section, right?
What's that?
It's the Jackson Henderson section, or the, actually, it's not even that. It's Harrison, it's the Harrison.
Between Harrison and Jackson, right?
It's actually Harrison Marshall.
Sorry, Harrison and Marshall, yeah.
So furthest one up.
Yeah, there are several locations where Patterson Avenue intersects at an angle, and there's a potential to close those segments if a traffic study were to demonstrate that it wouldn't significantly impact the traffic operations, or if the impact of those to traffic operations was an acceptable cost to return to the benefit of either more open space or improved operations at the remaining signals. Consider partial or full closure of streets adjacent to the park. There were lots of discussions about closing either portions of Harrison or Jackson Street where they cross over the park. Closure may be the right idea. Partial closure may be another idea where that street becomes something less auto-centric and more park-focused, such as removing the existing asphalt and revealing the traditional cobblestone, or maybe raising that cobblestone up 6 inches so that it's at level with the curbs, so that actually the cars come up into that area. That's called a shared street, where cars are allowed to use that space, but they're sharing it with pedestrians and bicyclists. It's kind of like a park space, and they travel through it quietly. It's kind of like Hudson Place, south of River Street, where you can drive into the Terminal Plaza and turn around. But that area is only low in volume because there's no through traffic. But if you can envision that type of street environment narrower street on one of these streets where cars have to come up into it, that would dramatically slow down traffic and create a shared environment where you wouldn't be eliminating the access concerns, which is typically the biggest gripe when it's recommended to close a street. You're limiting access or you're preventing me to get from one place to another. So a shared street option is a way of balancing that, particularly if the park is going to span across that street. Focus on pedestrian connectivity at park spaces. This was something that was written in all the different groups. As you get closer to a large park, the priority for pedestrians becomes larger, and so the design of the intersections and the sidewalks heading to the park becomes should be more pedestrian focused, more of a priority as you approach the park. Study separation of local and through traffic. Lots of concerns from all the different groups about the traffic that travels through Hoboken from other jurisdictions to get to or from the Holland Tunnel as a shortcut. There are ways to address that, and in fact there's already been some significant effort on Dawn's behalf with Jersey City and Hudson County to look into how we can address that on a more global manner. Consider pedestrian and bicycle uses in design of improved streets. So as development occurs, as areas get improved, as streets get rebuilt or redesigned or incorporated into the future development, there's an opportunity to reprioritize pedestrian and bicycle uses to fit the more mixed-use environment that is anticipated in the future in this area. And so when those designs are happening, that's a great time and an efficient time to incorporate these concepts and needs into the streetscape. Collaborate with New Jersey Transit on the Hudson Bergen Light Rail crossing traffic signal. Two groups raised concerns about the amount of time waiting at certain intersections. If someone wants to call it out, feel free. I always forget exactly which one it is because
On
The light on Marshall Drive.
It's Marshall. It's the signal light on Marshall Drive that's right next to the crossing for the HBR. That's connected directly with the crossing to prevent people from getting caught near or on the tracks. But there's certainly an opportunity to address the time that and the wait time that's there. Yes.
I may be a little bit off the turf, but it's certainly relevant, being an eyewitness from my unit there, right over there, about trying to get New Jersey Transit or whatever the powers that be to put up a gate there, because the light doesn't seem to work. There's been a few accidents.
I asked them, I actually made a call because I went through, a friend was driving and the train was coming right at us, so I actually asked them to look into what's happening with that timer and whether it's working properly. And I'm also asking them about the possibility. They're saying that traffic-wise it's too difficult to put up a gate, but I'm with you. I'm concerned that something eventually
This way they all just honk the horn at all crazy hours, you know, trying to sleep.
Has there actually been an accident where the light rail hit?
Oh, I saw it. I was right there. I was reading. It was right out my window.
Yeah.
People drive into there once in a while. But that's really.
But no one has been killed
No one
yet.
has been- right.
Yes.
That's a big story.
That's what obviously we'd like to avoid, so. But yeah, I will, I'm waiting for, I'll follow up with them and try and get more of a clear response on that. I mean, the other question too, which I think I was talking to you about, is whether or not we can make it so that people can make that left.
The left turn on.
The left turn, because what's happening is people are trying to like go around and make a left, and it's just creating
We
more time
should be able to do that when you say, Ian, it's not a county road, Marshall Drive. So that's within our purview to make that, we can make it left only and right only. We can do that. But I think, after this, we talk about the next step, but we'll go to the traffic engineer probably. That could happen pretty quick.
It seems to me that the operations of the adjacent intersection probably weren't entirely taken into consideration when the signal timing was developed for the crossing, and this type of side effect that is kind of difficult to anticipate in advance it's good to get that feedback, and it's not too difficult to reconsider and make that system, make those two signals work better together. And then finally, developing a program to encourage transit use and alternative transportation. And we're feeling it all over with rising gas prices, but the idea of trying to help encourage people to come to Hoboken via transit or via other modes of transportation other than driving and looking for parking. I heard some people in my group say that when people think about going into Manhattan, they always think about taking the train. Like to go out at night or to go to a restaurant, they always are often thinking about taking the train as opposed to driving in. There's a reason for that, and there's no reason why Hoboken can't also try to encourage that type of activity. We get a lot of people coming into the city to enjoy the city, but they can choose to come here by car or by transit. They probably just don't know the benefits or haven't been thinking about those benefits. And just to talk about that in a little bit broader terms, the experiences I've had with large-scale projects that have access to transit facilities. Just a campaign of awareness can significantly switch people's preference from cars over to transit. It seems like a little bit of advertising doesn't really have that much of an effect. But if you've been on the PATH train over the past half a year, the Devils Prudential Center, the Devils Stadium, PATH has been advertising significantly to get to Newark by PATH, and it had a dramatic shift in the amount of people who chose to drove versus take the train to Newark. And Hoboken is an excellent place to take a train to, if or bus to, if the idea came to mind. And this is one way to try to convince people that this is a great way to get here. And what that does for locals is it alleviates some of the congestion and some of the parking issues that happen at certain times of the week. So that's a summary. Again, the memo itself is much more detailed. It lists specific locations. It describes some of the concepts in more detail. And it also is a great way for you to either add information or question or challenge some of the ideas that were brought up. I will say that some of the ideas that I felt were a little bit out of the ordinary or maybe not the most easily implementable, I kept out. So the memo isn't a comprehensive list of every single idea that came out of the public workshop. But I would say it's about 80–85%, which is pretty good, which means that most of the ideas that came from the community were logical, made a lot of sense, and they're typical for people who have familiarity and understanding of the area. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to use this. I mean, the city really has a checklist of things that they could pick from, a nice long menu of things that they could choose from to see what they want to move ahead on.
So we have hard copies to give everyone, and I'm going to send out emails so that everyone can look at it. But just following up on some of the things that Ian's talking about, especially with the traffic study, I do feel strongly that regardless of what happens with the development, I mean, we all know there's talk of big levels of development, that right now there are some changes that we could make. And I've actually, working with Councilwoman Bruno, I actually called, she got the number for me, and we reached out to, the city has a consultant who does transportation engineering, and so we want to sit down and talk to him about putting together a traffic study and figuring out how many of these roads can we open up, and can we possibly use the master plan that changes the direction. Actually, Ian, if you want to sort of walk us through the
Sure.
master plan proposal for creating more of a traffic flow. These are things that we could be doing sooner rather than later. Like you said, maybe it's not, to me it feels like the traffic is overwhelming, but maybe if we make some of these changes, it will start to feel better and be better for the whole community.
First, I want to apologize for coming late and in these clothes. We know most everybody in the room. I know Alan, Gary. I'm sorry I don't know you, man. Terry LeBruno. Did you introduce everybody?
No,
It's a small group. We know Stan, we know Ann, we know Josh. My pleasure meeting you, and I know Eric and I know Lane. Rami, Rami, right?
Yes.
This has been, for me, meeting Ian, who's done all this work voluntarily. And the gentleman behind you, and Josh and I met with New Jersey Transit pretty recently, and Josh, all voluntarily on his time, has helped us so much with having New Jersey Transit come in and improve the signage so that more people will take transit, and even so much down by the light rail station on Second to put more signage so they know about the bus routes that occur in Jersey City. What I want to ask Ian, and we met informally in Panera, Dawn and I and Peter will now take this to the traffic engineer, whose name is Wendell Bibbs. And then from there, the recommendations that he thinks we can implement, we'll take to the City Council administration. All of your input is so grateful and definitely appreciated. And you, Alan, summarized all my notes at that next workshop, so I appreciate that. But the question I want to ask Ian is, and if you can, maybe we can get input from this group, the guardrail that's on Observer Highway, I feel we should try to do that immediately without making a big deal production of it. Is that one of the changes we can make before we do a traffic study, or is that something that we really need the traffic study for?
You need a traffic study. You may not need
one
the
guardrail.
The guardrail, Gary, that's on Observer Highway, in all of the groups, the guardrail on Observer Highway, it's by the gas station.
By Newark and Observer.
If that guardrail was closed 60, 70 years ago because there was an accident and a person was killed, but that's when there wasn't as many cars and things. If that was open, then Alan, we talked about this in our group, if that guardrail wasn't there, you can go to Adams or Clinton from Observer Highway. What do you think, Aaron? I want to open up the dialogue because I really think that that would help a lot.
I think the difficulty with these people coming into town trying to cut across.
They'd have 3 outlets now, Jackson, Adams,
If they're
and
coming
Clinton.
into town and they're trying to make a left across where the guardrail currently is, then they've got all the traffic to contend with that's coming straight at them out of town. And that's
Right,
where,
Right, so unless we, and that's why maybe we should have Ian
that's
sort of walk
where
through the
Ian
proposal.
spoke about that you get the lineup of traffic that seems like it's very overwhelming, even though.
Because there's only one outlet, guarded, there's only Jackson or Park Avenue. But if there was Jackson, Adams, and Clinton, and Park, that's, how many avenues, you said there's 50 cars coming in?
Yeah, that's
So
maximum.
now that's about 11, it's sort of like when you come in from Newport, right? How many of you travel by car from Newport? You have 3 decisions. You could go to Jersey Ave, you could go Grove, or you can go, I guess it's Henderson or Mill. You have 3 choices. But when we come in town now, it's Jackson or Park Avenue. I mean, I'm not a traffic engineer, but to me,
Right,
it makes so
probably,
much
though,
sense.
Before we do something like that, that probably needs to be part of what we lay out for what we'd like to have looked at in a traffic study.
So you think the traffic study has to come before that decision?
Well, I think a study of that conversion needs to be done, but it doesn't need to be at the same scale as kind of this overall circulation study. So if you just want to look at how that will change traffic operations, it's just a matter of a couple of intersections that can be done. So it's a study would need to be done because the county's involved, since there's county roads as well. But it's not a major undertaking, and it's something that would have a significant benefit to the city.
Well, that's what Dawn and I, you talked about what few implementations before the big picture, before the New Jersey Transit development, before the Southwest development, just dealing with the traffic that we have right now.
Right.
We'd like to, did you talk about the stanchions at the intersections at all?
No, but I'd be happy to.
Would you please?
Yeah.
And I thank Ann for this.
I wanted to chime in for 2 seconds.
No, you're not allowed, Gary.
All right.
No, go ahead.
A little bit more, take a step back, a little bit more macro approach. The first list of things that you put up, which were the short-term goals. For the most part, everything that I read on that, skimming it quickly now, is something that applies to every place in town. And if you just took number 1 and enforced rules, major impact across the board. So I look at that list and I say, this is not particular to the Southwest. This is across the board, and this is an ongoing issue in town that you folks as the city council and us as the screaming public ask for legislation for things, and we get all these nice resolutions and ordinances passed, and then nobody enforces it. Whether it's the dog poop that you were speaking about before, or stop signs, or whatever it is. And I think it seems to be a continual problem that there's either not cooperation from the administration, or there's not cooperation from the police department, parking utilities, whatever.
Gary, I want to answer this because first of all, but in my 3 years' experience on the city council, that what you're talking about becomes a low priority in terms for the police department, in terms of violence, break-ins, drug trafficking, but there has to be. Now, there has to be a division that deals with that, and that's one of the items that's going to come up.
Yeah, it should be called patrolman.
Right, well, I think, and, you know, I've asked this question of like, how many cars,
If we got people, if we got our police department out of the cars, actually on their
right,
feet,
We do have-
and
we do
Gary,
have patrol.
and on their
Gary,
feet.
I've asked for that, for a breakdown of those numbers and, you know, pushing for, you know, moving more of our police out of the cars and
Yeah, I don't want to make
onto
this a whole
bicycles,
police
you know what I mean?
department
It's,
story,
no,
but
but
we
it's,
know that we have a
well,
police
it's-
department that has a lot of management, and unfortunately not enough patrolmen. It seems like to put them on the street to do basic things like 1 through 6. And I mean, it's great to have these meetings. I don't want to be negative about it in any way. It's not my intent, but it's really, you know, we need more cooperation.
right, but part of the process is, now we do, I hear what you're saying, but now we do have a document where it's like, you know, I'm not gonna just, we did the report and we sent it, I'm gonna meet with Director Bergen, we're gonna meet with the police, we're gonna, you know, like now we have, we've come together as a community, we had 50 people come to that first meeting, I mean, we've got real public input, and this is what we want to happen. And what my idea to do this is to say, let's start with the 4th ward. Let's make the 4th ward our pilot study and like really focus on getting it done in the 4th ward, and then taking that model and spreading it throughout the rest of the city. Because it does seem like if we start saying we're going to do it throughout the city, it just doesn't happen. So maybe if we start small and build it out from there, and start with, so we've got the basis for a plan here, and we're going to keep
Deputize
building
me,
on it.
I'll start writing tickets.
Gary, you're going to be the first part-time hire to pick up the dog poop. But right now,
Only my own dogs.
there's just one response, Gary, not to have a back and forth dialogue, or not negative, positive, but the stanchions. And Ann convinced me, just the stanchions alone. When you don't have the enforcement, because we're low on the totem pole with crosswalks, just so that Elaine and anybody who's never heard this story understand, the cheap stanchion will eliminate parking in the crosswalks. You can't park there if the stanchion is there. Now, what we asked Joe Buccino to do, who's the director of signal and traffic, is to give us an estimate. And we've asked the parking utility to give us the intersections that should have a stanchion, but the ones where the car's coming this way, so it would be this corner that would be the problem.
Yeah,
Gary
it's
knows
the inside
The
view.
the inside visibility. Gary knows the terminology better than me. But just putting stanchions on the inside visibility, stanchions.
It's a stick so that somebody can't
You
park.
know where Domino's Pizzeria is?
Or open a side door.
There's one right here on
It's
Market.
the one right out in the corner that I keep fighting with Joe about, that somebody runs
But
over.
Elaine,
When he does
You
that,
live in the Sky Club, right? You said, if you think of where Domino's Pizzeria is, that road is curved. And it took an elderly gentleman, who I can't remember his name, Mr. Glassel, I think. John Glassel. He gave me the idea to put 4 or 5 stanchions there, so nobody can park in front of Domino's. And that really opens up your visibility there. And so even though they're not the most beautiful looking things, but if we put 1 on each or 2 on each visible inside visibility corner, that takes the problem.
Well,
People
one of
parking
them,
in the
if you'd like to elevate the prettiness of the whole thing, then way that they deal with it.
Painted my school colors blue and gold, that's what I
Yeah,
was in
yes,
the gym.
coach, no problem, coach. The way that it's handled in Herald Square, right outside of Macy's, is very nice. There are these very large, heavy-duty, gotta be 4 or 5
Yeah.
feet in diameter,
Flowers.
concrete
Yeah, love them.
things, and there are evergreen bushes in them, there are flowers in them on a seasonal basis, and they help to direct the traffic and
Problem,
keep
Gary.
people in line.
Yes,
We,
what is the
we
problem?
checked into it. It was Ian's idea, or Peter Cunningham came up with the idea of something like that. But according to our corporation council, it has to be breakaway for New Jersey not New Jersey Transit
So
Department.
the law is different in New
For who?
Jersey.
According to Steve Klein. Now we
Has to be
can,
breakaway for
the
Car.
the car,
a car?
the car, yeah.
Any object installed in the street
Yeah.
has to be designed for breakaway.
That's according to
So
New
if
Jersey.
the car drives, for example, all the parking signs that are on the sidewalk, for example, there's a post that's
In the ground, and
set
there's
into
a
the
second,
concrete.
there's a second.
The other post is bolted to it,
Right.
and that is designed so that if a car hits it in either direction, it breaks away.
Well, I can guarantee you that the one on my corner here is breakaway, so somebody runs over it on every 2 or 3
Well,
week
I guess
basis.
what he raises a good point, isn't there, I mean, it doesn't have to be those massive concrete things, there's probably a smaller version that could be breakaway,
I
right?
think the
Without-
idea of the
with
stanchions
adding
was,
flowers.
we think that it'll make a dramatic improvement in crosswalk visibility for pedestrians.
Yeah.
And so as a pilot, we thought it would be very helpful to have those installed and play a little bit like their locations. Do you have just one right by the crosswalk, or do you have one right by the crosswalk and another one 5 feet back, so that you really prevent cars from parking too close? Because on certain intersections, as you approach it, you really need those cars to be far enough back so that you can, when you're approaching it, you can see far enough, like across, not only for pedestrians crossing in a crosswalk, but also if there's another car coming, because not everybody comes to a complete stop at some stop signs. So it helps to improve safety of vehicle and vehicle. In fact, we looked at that at 9th Street and Willow Street, where where Joe Buccino installed them, and there's been a couple people who were concerned with that, and the feedback has been that it's really improved visibility there. So it's a pilot, it's an effort, and there's definitely better ways to do it, but if we can demonstrate that this works and that it's improving safety, then there's an opportunity to look at putting more money into more permanent
It
solutions.
has to be a
It's something pretty-
multi-layered thing though, because
Absolutely.
the parking sticks by themselves, the no parking sticks by themselves need to be maintained because people abuse them and run over them with their Escalades, and also right here on the corner, I mean, this is like a personal vendetta.
Yeah, they mustn't like you because none of the others have moved. You're the only intersection where we lose the stanchion. You must-
Yeah, you know why?
Have you
Because
been
it's the
see-
people in City Hall who run them over on my corner, okay?
When they put the
So you don't want to
lights
start with this one. I
I'm ready
got
for that.
I got pictures of Rhonda's Jeep running them over.
So anyway, just to go back to your original question about this first intersection to open up. Where the guardrail is, there's a light there already, right? So it would be a matter of reprogramming that light to actually accommodate 6 directions.
Yeah, it sounds a little unwieldy, but it probably isn't as simple as just reprogramming that light. You probably need a couple more faces, signal faces, pointing in different
Left
directions.
only.
Our friends at New Jersey Transit have that also mapped out on their rail yard redevelopment plan as actually turning that whole thing into.
Again, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Dawn and I spoke this morning about not waiting for New Jersey Transit.
Right.
Huh?
We don't want to wait for New Jersey.
To me, like haste makes waste here, understanding that intersection a little better.
Professional opinion on what?
On just taking the guardrail out, because that seems like, it just seems like a disaster waiting to happen to me.
Taking it out?
Yeah, without doing a proper study and determining
Oh.
what the traffic flow is gonna be through all of these roads. Because I saw what you at the transit event the other night, and it seemed obvious that it needed to be at least that comprehensive for it to even work. and you had a pretty extensive rethinking of that intersection area.
The concept originally comes from the Hoboken Master Plan.
Right.
It was recommended in that plan that the guardrail be opened up and that there be one-way in-out access using Newark and Observer. Just pulling it out without any type of study is not a good idea.
I agree.
Because
He said that before, but what he did say is a small study
Right.
of that
Yes.
particular
Yeah,
section,
that's a-
without waiting for everything the New Jersey Transit does. I don't mean cut it down tomorrow and everything's gonna be better. I mean a small study of that area to see if it's feasible, so that we can open up the congestion now while we're all living in.
But you also recall the way that was, Henderson Marin Boulevard was still an afterthought in that. What you had was traffic continuing on Newark Street and traffic continuing on Observer. You didn't
I wouldn't
really,
worry.
You really didn't have this. I mean, the Henderson Marin Boulevard traffic still had a choice between going left or right. They weren't going through the intersection, to my knowledge.
Right, I wouldn't worry too much about the details on how the intersection would operate. That's the purpose of the study. So
It
it
just scares me
can
'cause I-
definitely operate a different way. It was closed for a reason, and it was probably done because the needs at that time were nowhere near what the needs are now. And it was easy to close it and just settle the situation without taking into consideration all the traffic volumes that we're experiencing now. So I wouldn't worry too much about the details on how it operates. There are much more complex intersections that traffic engineers have to deal with on a regular basis. There are definitely solutions there. In fact, I think that the opportunity there is it's pretty intuitive when you from a traffic engineer perspective, when you look at it, especially in plan view, the way to get the signal timing right. It's not the easiest one, but it can definitely be solved. It's definitely worthwhile pursuing, but because of the fact that it's cross-jurisdictional, it's got county issues as well as the city, and it intersects with Jersey City. Because of the fact that someone actually does have to figure out how the signals themselves get reallocated and what other phases are necessary. The timing has to be reset. The phasing has to be reset. There are some technical aspects that need to be looked into in order to make that intersection work right. But it's a great opportunity for the city to look at, and it can be done in short term. It can be done a lot faster than waiting for a larger comprehensive study.
And obviously, there's a big issue of, stopping traffic in all directions too. There's a fire call, because that's a very, very active firehouse.
Right.
They often exit left. They often exit left on that.
Right. I mean, they come out either direction that they need to go, but they come out of there pretty damn quick. So
The idea came up. This topic came up. The master plan concept of opening up that intersection came up during the workshop, and the fire chief at the time said, as long as we have our hatched space in front of the fire department, the firehouse, which wouldn't be taken anyway, we would be able to negotiate, and actually it would allow us to have a couple other ways to get in and out as well. So,
Because you want a parking center.
well, that's to open up Madison.
No, yeah, oh, that meant.
That's what I was just gonna ask. We didn't talk about opening up the street behind the firehouse. Did that come up at all yet?
Yeah, that was listed here, and that's the second to last bullet here. And I think that's a really great opportunity for the city, because again, you're opening up another access point. And right now, you got a way to get in at Jackson, way to get in at Park. So you probably get like 70% of the cars making a left turn at Jackson, 30% making a left turn at Park, or maybe there's a residual amount going to Bloomfield and Washington. I'm not taking into consideration right now. But of those cars that are turning at those two locations, if you open up Madison, you just pull 30% from here and 5% from here, and you redistribute those numbers, and it really relieves the pressure, particularly at Jackson.
When you relieve that pressure, though, you increase capacity. When you increase capacity, nature abhors a void, especially in densely populated urban traffic areas, no? Which will only lead to more.
What's the middle part when you increase capacity? What?
You increase capacity, you open up a void. You
Build it and they will come.
Yeah, and the next thing you know, that 30% additional capacity that you thought you had suddenly becomes a new bottleneck, but now you have 30% more traffic.
The roads are all there except for that one little segment. We're not widening any streets, and we're not making the we're not building extra lanes. That one segment just allows the cars that are already coming into Hoboken to get in one different way. The induced demand that you're talking about is a function of widening roadways, building extra capacity. This idea here is an idea of reallocating existing capacity so that it improves operations at certain locations and reduces some of the safety concerns as well.
I don't think you would have to revisit the whole thing 30, 60, 120 days later also, because there's going to be sort of like a learning curve of people changing their habits, and 60 days from when you initially sort of like either reopened up one or two of those streets, you might have like a whole different kind of a flow to the positive, but it just might be spread out differently, where again the staging, the lights, the phasing, and everything else would probably need to be re-examined. I would think there would be a standard operating procedure for that
actually,
type of thing.
the study itself, the process of the study would say, what's the existing traffic volumes at these intersections? Like, what are the design, Henderson and Observer and Newark, how would traffic volumes change, which is what you're talking about. So the traffic engineer's responsibility in that study is to redistribute traffic at those different locations because of the new routes. So that's part of you have an existing analysis and then a future analysis. And really the feasibility that Tara was condition operate at better levels of service, which is the technical term for how intersections operate. Does this intersection operate at better level of service than when it was previous, than an existing condition?
And then there needs to be like an additional sort of site reevaluation as well. I would think a physical evaluation sort of after you've implemented it, because people always also find inevitably people will find a route that we didn't think of, you didn't think of, even as the professional sometimes, like, you know, they're cutting across the parking lot that's no longer full or something like that.
That's right, yeah. There definitely needs to be like this kind of follow-up to get feedback on whether or not the routing worked out the way it was modeled.
Actually, a couple questions. One for you is kind of going back to that whole Marshall Street light nightmare. Is what is the average in your gas? What's the average traffic light like in your?
We talk in terms of cycle length, which is if you're coming up to an intersection and
light turns red immediately, how much longer until it turns green once again?
It's actually like the light turns green, and then it goes through how much longer before it turns green again? So it's green, and then it goes yellow, then red, and then green again, right?
Okay.
So that whole cycle length is typically 90 seconds.
Okay.
That's a typical cycle length.
The only reason I bring that up is with that whole Marshall Street that we just discussed before, usually it's not too busy of a road. Occasionally it is because the Sky Club garage that lets out on 2nd Street, that's the only way to go. You have to go left on 2nd, you have to make a left on Marshall. And then there's occasional times where Harrison Street gets closed. There's a lot of construction going on there, it happened last week. So everybody coming west on 2nd Street has to go past Harrison because you can't turn left on Harrison because it's closed. Then you can't make a right because there's one way. And you find this out last second, oh boy, the road's closed. So you continue on, make a left on Marshall Street.
Right.
Last week, for example, there were about 15 to 16 cars, actually maybe more, all going all the way up until 2nd Street. I timed the light from when it turns red until when it turns green again. So it's not even a full cycle. It's just, you know, and it's not even much longer because I think it's only green for like 20 seconds. No lie, it's between 5 and 6 minutes long.
Is it always that way, or just when the train is coming?
When I time it, which has been a few times, I mean, I'm listening to almost 2 full songs before it changes. And what happens is there's people want to make, not many people want to make a left on the Patterson there. Most people want to make a right on the Patterson or a left on the 1st Street. Occasionally you see a left on the Patterson, but not very often. So what happens is, if you want to make a right, it's no big deal because you can make a right at a stoplight. You just stop and make a right. However, what happens here is this left is kind of, you know, can you do it or can you not do it? Because if it's 2 one-way roads, Usually you can make a left at a stop sign or a light, it's allowed. But here, First Street's only one way, so you feel like, okay, it's allowable, but Marshall's not, and Patterson Ave is not. So it kind of, are you allowed to or you're not? And I know there's a lot of issues with respect to everybody doing it one day, including, regular people, taxi drivers, police officers, and then the very next day, people getting tickets for it. The same police officer did the day before. And I don't have a problem with giving a ticket there, just put a sign or something letting people know they can or cannot make a turn there. But 6 minutes is really crazy. And if you're a 15th car and only 6 cars make it, you're waiting almost 20 minutes to make a turn. So what's happening now is Marshall Street, because it's one lane one way, one lane the other, people are cutting over to the other lane. Like when someone wants to make a left and they decide to wait, like when I wait because I want to time it, people are going around me into the other lane traffic, going around, not even stopping for light, just going and making a right turn, or even a left. And so they're not stopping for light, and it's happening. It's actually, I've seen it where it's the light turns green for the other direction, and people near accidents. So it's actually extremely dangerous there. And I really think that 6 minutes, there's no excuse. A 6-minute light, there's no excuse. That's one point I have to make. Second point is, do you think roads being in extremely bad condition where there are potholes in them causes a traffic concern to pedestrians? And the reason I bring that up is because I know there's many times, when I'm driving the upper west part of Hoboken, northwest corner, the ShopRite, where all I care about is focusing down the roads, making sure I don't hit a huge pothole. And then afterwards, I'm like, holy, I just went 20 seconds, 30 seconds without really even looking and seeing if anybody was near me. I could have hit somebody. Just swerving left and right, trying to avoid these potholes. And I know, like on Jackson Street, when you're on Observer, I'm sorry, I knew
Those are on the list to be fixed.
Yeah, well, I think that's been there for
The high
years.
priority
Oh,
list.
it's horrific.
Yeah.
Where, if you're not even focusing on the sidewalks or the stop signs, because all you're focusing on is not hitting that nasty pothole that's going to dent your car. I mean, I understand, you should be focusing on not hitting somebody for a rim that could be fixed. But, is that an issue? And do you think possibly, I mean, I can see on the other end, having perfectly smooth road, people will fly 40 miles an hour. Like I think on the other extreme, having extremely bad roads, it's got to be some sort of traffic concern. I don't know what your opinion is on that.
Well, of course, swerving around the road is a lot less safe than just driving in a straight line. I think you might be driving a little bit faster, not you, but just people in general. I think people are driving a little bit faster in those roads that you're describing up the northern part of Hoboken, because there's nothing there, and because you're just focusing on driving straight. My observations in that area is that everybody picks up speed. The speed limit is still 25 miles an hour in there, but I'm sure people are trying to do 35, 40 if they can. If they've got bigger SUVs, then they probably can take those potholes more than smaller cars. Is it more dangerous for pedestrians on those sidewalks if cars are swerving around? Sure, it's definitely more dangerous. Is it a function of the potholes, though? I think it's a function of the speed more than the condition of the roadways. In fact, most times, poor roadway conditions slow down traffic, and so that's a safer condition. I think the reason why people are swerving all over, I think that combination causes the unsafe condition.
I mean, I think sometimes like brick roads usually cause people to go slower, but they don't add the actual extra concern of hitting a pothole. So in that situation, you're going slower, but you can also drive smoothly and straight.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that potholes is a good traffic calming.
Yes. Yeah.
That save us a lot of money.
Okay, so that was a question. I think I answered that well. Thank you.
Approach that the cars come at each other. For pedestrian visibility, you want you want the cars that approach at those two places to be able to see pedestrians to the right and to their left. So those are 4 spaces already.
Right, okay, I got you on that.
But in addition to that, to prevent the rolling condition that you're talking about, that's a problem of one car not being able to see the other car. And if you ask any car who's rolled out past the stop bar into the crosswalk, they say, I can't see if there's a car coming. I'm just trying to be safe and not pull out into oncoming traffic because they have the right of way.
Sure.
And that's perfectly understandable. But typically the reason why they can't see is because when they're at that stop bar, there's a car parked illegally on the opposing street, blocking their view of a car coming at the proper speed.
Correct. So I agree with you that there are the 2 and the 2. But I mean, you know, and with all due respect though, the other 2 and 2, the other 4 should just equally, I mean, we don't necessarily need the stanchions there. We don't necessarily need the stanchions there. But on the other 4, I would agree that we do. But my concern is that, you know, us putting the stanchions there as a, and the excuse for putting them, and I think that, you know, why not put them there? There's a purpose for them. But the excuse of putting them there because we can't enforce it is a little embarrassing.
No,
And not for the police,
Here's why I gotta
but
stop.
for the parking utility. Can I understand they close like at 8 o'clock at night?
Brian, let me stop you for 1 minute. See, you're saying the excuse for putting them there is they could save lives. If I park in the intersection and I get a ticket, or not even get a ticket, my point is saying that is somebody could be issued a ticket. Even with
still park
foot
there.
patrol, they can go around the
Still
corner
park there.
and somebody can park there again.
No,
But with the stanchion, you can't.
Right.
You remove the opportunity. So even if you had 100 patrolmen, at some point, people want to break the law, they can break the law. Same with double parking. At any point, what's the negative
I'm not
for
gonna,
it?
no, there's no negative.
Except expense, cost.
There's no negative.
Well, there's a cost is
But,
negative.
I've heard this before, that, you know, 8 o'clock at night, Hoboken Park Utility closes, or whatever the time is, and then the police officers, you know, I mean, whether it's a patrolman or not, I don't know, I don't want to get into that story, but, you know, the parking utility, one of their main jobs, I believe, is to.
Yeah, but Ronnie, there's a little misunderstanding there, which is my understanding, and what has been said at the city council meetings a number of times, is that when the city has an ordinance that involves parking, it can go out and give a ticket and collect all the money for the ticket, with only like a $5 portion of it going for court costs. What you're talking about at the end of the block is a state law, it's not a city ordinance. So there's actually been an enforcement decision made and keeping all the money, as opposed to ticketing at the crosswalk where they can only keep like $5 of the $75 ticket. So they've actually said this in the meetings where it's not their priority. Their priority is on ordinances that the fees can be collected. It hasn't been said lately.
I would say, Lane, in the 3 years I've been there, I've
But
never heard it
this is
said at a council meeting. I've never heard it said.
It's been a while. It's been a while.
And I just recently got a ticket in a crosswalk from Anthony Romano, who he's the highest ticketing male in the city of Hoboken in its history.
Who?
Anthony Romano, not the freeholder.
No.
Have you ever met Anthony Romano? Oh, he's a gentleman, you have to meet him. He's a savant. He gives tickets,
He's what?
he's a savant.
This is wrong.
Savant.
Okay.
Rami, his mission is to give tickets. He has the most tickets of
Should give him
anybody
more.
in the history of
Yeah.
Hoboken. So my point of telling that, Elaine, is I don't know if it's a question of its low priority. I think it's.
For the parking utility,
Who's
and there's
working?
no priority to it. There's
Well,
no priority in the parking
For
utility to
Anthony, it's
crosswalks.
high priority. For Anthony
Right,
Romano, it's very
that
high
may
priority.
very well be the
That's a
case.
police officer.
But
No,
I actually,
Parking
Parking
utility?
utility.
Okay.
I'll introduce you to him.
I've actually witnessed accidents in intersections where the cause of the accident was that a car had to edge past the stop sign to see around a truck
Absolutely.
illegally
My daughter
parked
had
on a
the same
corner
accident.
to find a car come barreling through and ending up getting hit. And the police officer who investigated the accident didn't ticket the truck that was blocking the view of the vehicle. So it's not the most.
And Ian's had the same exact story.
I actually-
Lane-
I have the
guess- I
same
guess
exact
we
story
got-
with my daughter, and I
But
don't
then
know why they
I
can't
actually
get that
asked the police
ticket.
officer to ticket the vehicle that was illegally parked and he refused.
And then he reported that some woman was,
That was
this is
very
Ann,
nice.
some
That
woman
was really
was
nice to him.
screaming and yelling at him like a crazy person. Her? I don't think so.
And
You
my
may.
daughter had the same accident.
Me, maybe.
Right by the hospital, Willow Avenue, and the officer could not, for some reason, give the person in the intersection a ticket. I actually would experience the same thing, and I'm not sure why.
That's kind of crazy, isn't it?
I don't know, I have to
If
check.
they're illegally parked, they're illegally parked.
If they can't take it, then tow it.
What I'm thinking is,
Anyway,
just, you know, enforcing the rules is something that there really should be no question about. You know, and the comments that Lynn just made, I think are absolutely, I've never heard them before, and if that's true, it's there's no excuse for it. And, you know, I don't want to put all the pressure on the police, you know, because I think they have other issues. I think,
It's not a high priority.
you know, but I think that our Hoboken Park Utility, even if they have one person working, I understand no one wants to work at 2 in the morning, but one person walking at 2 in the morning, it's 200 guaranteed tickets. And, you know, even if we only get $5 for that, it's $1,000 that Hoboken will get.
The only thing I'd say, I mean, name me a city in the state of New Jersey that has any enforcement from 12 to 8. Does New York City have enforcement in midnight hours?
Oh, yeah.
Only 1 square mile.
Right.
And we strive to be the best
There's
city.
a lot of people who go out at night.
24/7?
24/7.
I
A lot of
gotta
people
do
who
that.
go out
You
at
will be
night in the city, and you come out of the club, if you were illegally parked, you thought you were gonna get away from it, you'll be on the west side highway getting your
You have to
car.
hire more people for that. I mean, you know, it has to be an added expense, but it could be certainly made up.
But it becomes
With the
a
10
profit
year.
center.
Yeah, I agree. I'm open to that. But, you know, we have to hire more people. You can't use the same amount of personnel to now add another
Or,
shift.
and it doesn't even necessarily have to be, I don't think, every night. If you have, just
There's
pick
a price.
2 random nights, or just 2 random nights you pick a week, and they change, it keeps changing, things like gas station.
Right, so.
But you know what, we are getting off
We are getting off
on
topic.
enforcement, and it is a problem.
It's a critical
But
problem.
the other things that we're trying to do, or at least the suggestions we've gotten from the 50 people that attended that last workshop, their suggestions, Ian's help, has been, okay, what we have, what we can work with. What can we work with what we have?
Well, we have a parking utility, so I think enforcement's not difficult to do, and in fact, it's the first thing that's on there.
It's
And I
on
think
the
that,
short-term
along with-
list. Right.
And that with the standard cut, I think would be a wonderful combination. But I don't know who's gonna take the step, in actually trying to make enforcement a priority.
Well, that's our job, that's my
Well,
job
that's
as
part
part
of
of
where I'm
the
coming
chair.
from, that's part of where I'm coming from, saying like, let's start with one ward and figure out how to really make this work better.
Hire our own parking utility.
So, no, not hire our own, but work with them to really focus on getting it done and being more aggressive and doing.
I think Dawn answered that when she said to Gary, yeah, it's been a problem, at least in my tenure, but now we have something in writing. We've had our second workshop. We're meeting with law enforcement tomorrow, Wally Wareham, Lieutenant Wareham. So Ronnie, that's all we can do. We can't snap the fingers and immediately get 100% enforcement, but we're trying our very best. That's
Maybe you
what
can
we
even,
tell you.
a parking utility, to sit in, a member to sit in on a meeting.
We've had.
Rami, we have I work on a project in Karachi, Pakistan, and we had made recommendations at some of the intersections there to change it from stop control to signalized intersections. And the local director that I was speaking with about those recommendations was concerned because they felt that the drivers weren't going to follow the signalized intersection as much as they would follow the stop signs for whatever reasons he described. So he said it would have to be enforced as well. So he was concerned that the enforcement would take time away from other enforcement responsibilities so that they would focus on this issue. So we came up with a redesign for that where we did these concrete medians so that cars would be forced to drive one way or another, and therefore completely eliminating the need for a signal there. Now it restricted things to some extent, and it wasn't the prettiest option, but it certainly addressed the issue, prevented cars from doing what we didn't want them to do, and at the same time eliminating the need for the limited resources of enforcement staff to further spread out their time to help enforce this operation here. And the stanchion option is kind of is an analogy to that, because while you could have enforcement agents working on those specific issues, it's clearly for the reasons that have been discussed, not as a critical issue as other enforcement concerns. And we can also address it using this static implementation that physically prevents people from breaking that law, and therefore the enforcement doesn't even need to focus on that at all. They can focus their energies on other areas. So it's true what you say that in theory it would be great if the enforcement agencies would just make people follow these rules, and then we wouldn't have to worry about them on a 24-hour basis. But the resources just don't allow that implementation to be done to its fullest extent. And the stanchions that are being recommended, which we've seen work very well in the limited places where they've been put so far, if they could be expanded to many other intersections, particularly those critical intersections, would significantly reduce those parking infractions. It would significantly increase the safety of pedestrian crossing at those locations. It would allow people to stop at the stop bar, not roll into the crosswalk, and see oncoming traffic without having to interfere with pedestrians making their crossings, all without the need for additional resources to human resources to enforce the parking at those locations. So there's a real benefit to it. And then some of these other things that we've listed that are also up here, like the illegal parking on the sidewalks, unnecessary honking, talking on cell phones, those other things that are also a concern. Those things that are not as easily enforced through some types of physical obstructions like the stanchions, the enforcement officers can focus on those. So there's that trade-off that this option really does a good job of doing that.
You explain that extremely well.
A little long-winded, but
He's got it covered.
All right, so I have I'll hand this out if anyone else has any more questions. Here's the report.
Ian, in your opinion, would it be feasible to put a turning signal at Jackson? A left, like an arrow? The traffic coming straight through doesn't need to be impeded at that
right.
point, but you could have a timed arrow that would actually stop traffic going out and coming in and making that left.
understood. I haven't done a full study of that location, but
What do you mean, then? Say it again.
At Jackson and Newark.
on Newark Street, trying
So
to make a
when
left
they're
on
coming
Jackson.
out from New Jersey
Have a
City
red
to
or green
Hoboken?
arrow. Have a
Yeah.
red or green arrow that actually allows or disallows people from either direction making
But
that
there's no
turn.
stop sign, there's no light there.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm asking what the feasibility would be to have a
Like
turning
that.
arrow there. Because the
Turning
other part of the problem that you have is there is a light at Patterson and Jackson. And there are a lot of times, especially during rush hour, that the block and a quarter between Newark and Patterson actually back up all the way to the corner.
Right.
And they're literally like 3 cars wide. And that then creates the backup on Newark Street in both directions because nobody else can turn into Jackson.
Yeah.
So you've got a timing issue also, which that would alleviate because you would then be able to flow traffic, if you timed the 2 lights so that
Yeah.
I mean, that would be
Signalization of an intersection can be done if you meet a warrant for one of 8 different possibilities. And one of them is the fact that you've got enough left turns trying to make a turn, and there's so many oncoming cars that people don't have enough time to make that turn. So I'm pretty sure
that's definitely an issue.
that intersection would meet warranting. Warranting doesn't necessarily mean, though, that a signal must be installed at that location. Otherwise, we'd have signals all over the place where we don't really need them. A signal would alleviate that pressure, but there are also drawbacks to that. And one thing that I've observed at that location is the queue of cars trying to make a left turn, especially during peak times. It's not so big of a problem when it stays on Newark, but as it wraps around under the overpass into Jersey Avenue, that's so narrow, that space is so narrow that it blocks the through traffic, and that's when it really gets
Interestingly enough,
congested.
there's actually room for 2 lanes there.
Yes, I've seen
But they've
that.
got 2 lanes going out on the other turn, which, doesn't make any sense.
Well, they do that for visibility,
Right.
for the driver's line of sight, and so that's
I
the
mean,
reason it was designed.
Most of the
Is
time
that
during rush
perfect-
hour, if people know what they're doing, people that are making that turn will line up on the left and everybody's in,
Right.
in the no lane. But, I don't know if that could be painted as 2 lanes, but it becomes really tough to turn
Do you mean
corner
on the
because of
Jersey
the
City
truck.
side and on Hoboken
on that curve, on that turn underneath the trestle.
Right under the
On the
trestle.
Jersey City side or on the Hoboken side?
It's actually, it's technically Jersey City.
It's the Jersey City side.
But, I mean, the problem actually is commercial trucks, because the commercial trucks come to lane. They cut the corner. And I've seen several cars get pinched.
This longer term option here where it says look at a study of study ingress options and solutions for major bottlenecks. And this is something that Don's been working on over the past couple of months, with Hudson County and with Jersey City. It's a group collaborative effort between the three entities, and a situation like that is something that should definitely be incorporated into it. I don't think there's a short-term answer for that just because there's so many entities involved, and there's also multiple intersections involved as well. But I definitely think the left turn arrow there makes a lot of sense.
Well, 'cause the other issue is that if you're driving out of town and you're coming down York, there are people cutting in front of you. Like, you could be, I mean, I've stomped the brakes leaving because, you
Just
know,
trying to cut across.
there are cars that'll cut across. And it's, you know, I mean, it is a danger.
I'm pretty sure that, based on the warrant criteria, a signal could be justified there. But that location is so close to the turn under the trestle that the operation of that whole area needs to be taken into consideration for that study, not just the warrant.
Well, and
So
that's
it's
something
an
they're doing with that,
interdependent issue.
with the transit.
Yeah, they were kind of looking at
Or
that, right?
anyway.
For the transit redevelopment, they were kind of looking at some of those issues. I know that you were specifically focusing on it.
It's a very broad area that's scoped.
Comment on one of the bullet points to collaborate with New Jersey Transit on HBR crossing signals. So there was people talking about traffic queuing along Marshall Street near the Second Street station there. That was planning the idea of gates possibly at the signals. You may want to look at that in a broader context of bottlenecks, because putting gates in at crossings may not be the best
Right, it's probably
solution.
not
It
possible.
might actually be even more because there's such frequent train service. But what that does is it gives the complete right of way to the trains, and if you do that, so the trains don't have to stop at all at the crossing. So you may want to look a little, carefully at it and see. Yeah, maybe more of a signal timing issue for now than putting in railroad cross gates. But again, something is maybe fold that into also any larger study of bottlenecks in that area rather than they don't want to push so much for the gates. New Jersey Transit would probably be very happy that they'd probably be even happier closing the crossing. Less liability, less faster travel times for the
Right,
train.
and right now, I just wanted to make sure that the timing
Definitely,
is working
yeah.
correctly, because
Timing,
I have
definitely,
I've received several complaints, and I myself have been
Sure.
in
I take the
salt train
train
coming right at us,
Yeah.
so.
There have been some
I
good
see- I
ideas
see
Just want to
already.
make sure that that part is
Yeah.
working well. I mean, I recognize that it's probably, and Andy can probably speak to this, but because it is so congested, it probably is not feasible to put any kind of a gate, but we do have to make sure that the timing is working right, everything's streamlined so that we reduce the chances of an accident.
When they built the light rail, did they even consider possibly putting an elevated or elevated tracks? I mean, I understand the cost would probably, I don't know what the cost would be, but did they even consider that, seeing as this is one of the main arteries of Hoboken?
No, I wasn't here during
I
that.
can't speak to exactly what was studied, but I could say just from general knowledge of what those processes are, that the analysis took into consideration, most likely took into consideration the existing traffic volumes, probably made a forecast into what type of growth is expected, but couldn't have anticipated specific developments such as Sky Club that were going to add a significant number of cars at a very concentrated location. And I'm just guessing here, but I would guess that when that study was done, the effects of Sky Club traffic were not taken into consideration at that specific intersection, and so the timing wasn't as, the timing to accommodate people coming out of Marshall Street was not as big of a concern, or was not a priority at all. I'm sure the volumes were very, very low, so 6 minutes, or whatever it was. The 6 minutes just seems really, really odd to me. So it sounds to me like they just never thought that there were going to be high volumes there. I think it just requires a revisit. Any traffic engineer who looks at that intersection probably come up with 2 or 3 ideas. I already heard some ideas about making an exclusive left turn, allowable during that wait, for example. That would alleviate some of that congestion.
Sounds good. You mentioned like an observer, there's a place that maybe to make more street parking to kind of calm down the flow of traffic a little bit.
It's the community mentioned.
Oh, well, you mentioned in your
All of
summary.
you.
Is there any other places that you found that maybe would be, or that the community found it would be a good idea to possibly butter more street parking? Because one reason that people park wherever they can park is because of the very limited supply of it. So I was wondering if there's any other places that you saw when you were studying the map or going around Hoboken, the community setting, that might be a good place to.
Well, if I were the traffic engineer hired by the city to look at the parking issue, I would definitely perform a survey that you're talking about. But in my voluntary effort here, I just took ideas and applied them without having gone through it and verified specific locations. That being said, Hoboken has a tradition throughout the entire city to include on-street parking, parallel parking in as many places as feasible, standing fire hydrants and certain specific crosswalks, school zones and stuff like that. So Southwest Hoboken could benefit by adding on-street parking to as many street segments as is feasible as it starts to develop. I don't have specific locations pointed out, but if there are places where there's no parking and there's really no good reason for it, then there's no reason why that shouldn't be looked at. And that's again something that the traffic engineer who works for the city could look into. And it's a simple analysis to determine is this a tight turn for fire trucks? Is there constant loading that happens in a certain location that justifies not having parking on the street at this point? Is there an active driveway, like those types of things? So I didn't answer your question specifically because I don't have a list for you.
And then another question, so you want to fix your answer, I got a couple. Like some streets is parallel parking, and I think there's one road, maybe around 5th or 6th, where I think it's actually kind of pulled in a little bit on diagonal parking. It seems like you get more spots in there if the road's wide enough.
4th Street across from the municipal garage, you mean? Between Grand and Benson?
Yeah, somewhere around there. There's a kind of pull in on an angled garage. I know, like in some cities, like San Francisco is required to pull in like that because those cars roll in. Is there an advantage to have if you have room for it to have those? Can you fit more? It seems like you probably fit more spots.
You get more cars per block segment.
If you have the room, if the road's wide enough.
Several highways like wide.
What's that?
Several highway like.
There's several. Well, I mean, I know like your presentation, the presentation you gave at the city council meeting mentioned some of these roads are extremely wide, which is great for traffic lanes. But if we have some roads that don't have, bike lanes. If we have some roads that we aren't going to do bike lanes and they're still considered wide, that might help. One thing, people aren't going to double park if there's no way to get around them. Right. And this could be a way to prevent you from double parking, and also give more spots to the.
If the objective is purely to provide more parking, then angle parking.
And also this would prevent people from double parking because it takes more room and there's no way to get cars around.
I think from aesthetic perspective, though, a lot of people feel that the angle parking is a lot less preferable than parallel parking. And me personally, I think that you could use that street space for better use by making it bike lanes or something. We're talking about implementing bike lanes in certain locations as a pilot. But there's no reason that every street in Hoboken couldn't, except for like the main streets like Washington, for example, couldn't have bike lanes on them. So, but that's long-term thinking. The point is that if you redesign a street from parallel parking to angle parking, you're never going to get that back. So we would really need to think long and hard about how we want to reuse that street space for the most balanced public, equitable public use. And maybe parking is the answer in some locations, but it's possible that other uses are better.
Rami, there's also a
major issue with backing into traffic.
backing.
I thought about that too.
There are cities that actually make you back in spots. The spots are angled
angled the other way.
direction, so you actually have to back into the spots. So when you're pulling out, you're pulling out.
In New York City now, all
yeah.
angle parking has to be back in.
That's actually a good point by CBS.
They would have to change the direction.
I always hate to back out of CVS.
That's a
Yeah.
tough place.
So are you saying in
Well,
the
they place
New York
on
City,
Washington-
you
on
can
Washington
only
same thing,
back
you're like-
into Angle Park?
I can't cite as, yes, in New York City, yes. And I can't cite a specific study at the moment, but I'm almost certain that there are several studies out there that have demonstrated that back-in parking is significantly safer than
That
front-end
makes
parking.
sense.
Angle
That's
parking.
something we should definitely look into.
Well,
Or they should change it to Hudson
just a
Street.
postscript on that, Rami. This came up in the last mayoral election. One of the candidates was proposing angled parking for the length of Washington Street. You know how it's on the north end right now. You have it. Well, apparently state law doesn't allow it because Washington Street is wider on the north end than it is in the south end. And if Washington Street, if the avenue is our widest street, you're not going to be able to get angled parking by state law on any other streets in the southwest. If you can't get it, what's that?
I mean, maybe Observer Highway. Observer Highway's pretty wide. Is it wide enough?
Yeah, but it's
Majority have two
The
lanes of
parking
parking
is
on
already-
either side.
Yeah.
you got this anyway.
I don't know, I was just thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying it's an idea that's come up before, and people like yourself have come up with it in the past, and it's been kiboshed because of state law.
Don't forget, Washington is two directions. You look at the Castle Point Terrace.
Right.
It's one direction and narrower, but they do have one side angle.
Right.
So it's wide, it might be wider than some streets, but it might be as wide as some.
We can take a look.
We can always
see
see
the
the
work on it.
You also don't have the traffic flow on Castle Point Terrace that you would say on Patterson Avenue or some of these other areas, where you'd essentially be backing into traffic.
One reason why parallel parking works pretty well on Washington Street is because you do have that double parking lane that people can make the parking maneuver and not completely interrupt the flow of traffic back and forth. If you had angled parking there, they would need to. Now, parallel parking lane requires 8 feet from the curb. The angle parking at like 60-degree angle requires 16 to 18 feet. So it's not much shorter than 90-degree parking, so you require significantly more street space to accommodate that.
Any other questions?
Does everybody know the direction? We're glad you joined us. We introduced everybody, but my name's Terry Bruno. Thanks for joining us. Does everybody know the next step, right? The next step is going to be with Wendell Bears, we said that.
Right.
And then the entire city council will get the report, as well as the administration. Thanks so much for everybody's involvement, especially Dawn, especially me. And Gary. Who's the photographer? That's Eric. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks again.
Cut.